Well, I have a question for you today. Who here has ever had an irrational fear? I know I've had a couple of them. Maybe it's a fear of flying. Maybe it's a fear of spiders. Maybe it's a fear. The lady at the store the other day, I wanted to buy a toy snake. Don't tell my kids, it's almost their birthday. And she didn't even want to touch the toy. She was so anxious about snakes. And if you're out here and you're like, guys, Jason, that is not an irrational fear. Well, anyway, I've been getting over my fear of heights, and I did it in one of the most ridiculous ways I probably could have. I like to hike. Does anybody here like hiking? We've got a few hikers. Yeah, absolutely. Has anybody hiked Angel's Landing in Zion, Utah? Yeah? Okay. Well, you guys know what this is like, but I'll tell you if you've never hiked it. This hike goes up, and about halfway, it just comes out on a cliff, but like a cliff on both sides. And the hike's in the middle. I'll just show you a picture. It's hard to describe. And I'm up there and I'm literally shaking, grabbing onto this chain, which does support my body weight, if you want to know. And I'm going and I hiked to the top. And I mean, it's 1,500 feet on both sides. But hey, I got over that fear. One that I still struggle with to this day is a fear of enclosed spaces. And so for me, it's if I can't get my elbows all the way out, my head is like, I'm in a safe place. I'm fine. Nothing's going to fall down on me. But my chest just gets tight, and I feel like something's squeezing all the air out. As a kid, I'd have nightmares about it. And I want to tell you a story about a lady who lived my actual nightmare. Her name was Immaculée Ilabagija. She was born in the 70s in Rwanda. And in the 90s, in 1994, across Rwanda, there was a sudden explosion of violence. You see, Rwanda's divided into two people. One half is the Hutu people, one ethnicity group. The other half is the Tutsi people. And Immaculée was a member of the Tutsi ethnic group. But the Hutus began hunting the Tutsi people across their country. This was terrible. It was really bad. I didn't give you a trigger warning, so I'm not going to go into all of the details, but just to show how bad the situation was, more people died in 90 days than have died in the last 3 years of war in Ukraine. It was awful. Well, Immaculée is out in the field, and she looks up and she sees the violence begin. And she knows what's happening. This wasn't something that came out of nowhere. And she turns and she starts running. Her dad says, go to this man's house. He's a pastor. He is a Hutu, but he's a pastor. He will take care of you. So she runs and she arrives there with 7 other women, 8 women at the door. And they say, they're killing everyone. We need help. Please let me in. Hide us. But some of the people who are chasing her see her go in. So the pastor takes her and these other women and they go back and they find their way through the building until they arrive at a tiny bathroom. 8 women crowded into a 3 by 4 foot bathroom in the back of the house. Now, I don't know if you can visualize 3 by 4 feet. I could not. And so I went up and I put some tape out on here. I measured it out. And I want to show you what it looks like when you stick 8 people in a 3 by 4 foot box. So I'm going to ask if we can get 7 band members to come up on stage. This box that I taped on the ground, 3 by 4 feet, the women crowded in. The pastor came up behind them and shut the door. Let's just see if we can fit 8 people in here. Might be a little tight. We'll keep our feet inside the tape. There's a little bit of room in front of me if you go, yeah, there we go. And as the women were hiding in this room, we might be falling out, we'll see. They could hear the voices of men who were looking for them. They could hear people even shouting their own names going through the house. They crowded in, and they stayed. They stayed in this room with very few breaks for 91 days. At the end, finally, Immaculée escaped. And so did the other ladies. Thank you. Everybody, hand for a band. But Immaculée was faced with a question that I think some of us are dealing with even right now, a question some of us have had to wrestle with in the past, and a question that many of us will have to wrestle with in the future. And that question is this: how could you ever forgive what you could never forget? Immaculate had grown up in a Catholic household. She spent every day reciting the Lord's Prayer, and as she was in this room, she prayed it over and over again, repeating a line that some of you maybe grew up with: forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. But after 91 days, how could you ever forgive what you could never forget? I really think that most people in this room are pretty forgiving. I try to be pretty forgiving. I think most of us, even if we're like, oh, sometimes I hold a grudge, I think we want to be. Now, many of you, if you've had kids, might have been in this situation before where a kid just comes up and punches you for no reason, or they headbutt you or kick you, and it's painful in that moment. And you look over, but you're like, he's 3. He doesn't have the emotional maturity to know what he did. Or even for my 5-year-old, he knows what he did, but I don't hold him to the same standards that I hold other adults in my life to. And I think in situations like that, it can be pretty easy to forgive. We can say, oh, I'm a pretty forgiving person. I let that go. Yeah, it hurt, and I'm going to tell him, I'm going to have a conversation about boundaries and about making the wise choice, but I'm going to let it go. I'm not going to think about it again. I'm not really talking about that, though, today. I'm talking about the phrase that she said that echoes in your mind no matter how many times you try to get rid of it. I'm talking about the memory of what he did, that maybe he said it didn't mean anything, it wasn't important, I didn't mean it that way, but you can't move on. I'm talking about the moment that you're walking through the grocery store, walking into church, and you're around maybe friends, loved ones, family, and something seemingly innocuous just brings out this feeling, this reaction inside of you, this memory where all of a sudden you're back in that fight. You're back in that moment. You're back in that fear and in that hurt. How could you ever forgive what you could never forget? As I've been praying about this and preparing for this moment, I've realized that across our culture, there's a pretty common answer for this question. An answer that it feels novel to me. Maybe it's been around for a long time, but I'm seeing it on social media, in popular culture, online, all over the place, over and over and over again. I hear our society tell us, don't forgive. You do not owe them. It was not your wound that you caused. It is not your problem to fix. You don't owe them anything. And I think sometimes we hear that and it's easy to take that in. It's easy to say, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I don't owe them. I don't owe them forgiveness. Yeah, they need to bridge this gap. They need to do something about this. They need to fix whatever it is that they broke. And across our culture, I think I see us becoming more hypercritical and unforgiving. I mean, cancel culture is alive and well. You can get criticized for the smallest mistakes, especially online. And I think you and I have heard of, lived with, seen people who've been told that forgiveness, letting it go, just means no boundaries, nothing changes in the relationship, and you just continue living in an unsafe, hurt situation. Some of us have lived with those people. Some of us have loved these people. Some of us have been these people. Unforgiveness can feel really empowering. The permission not to forgive, it is their problem, not mine. We want justice and retribution, but we also want personal healing. We want retribution, but when we take it, as we've talked about through the last few weeks, we can get caught in a cycle of retribution, a cycle of pain, where when we're the ones who are hurt, we can never measure punishment fairly, so we always over-punish or under-punish as we try to assert control, both over the offense and the offender, as we try to make sure that we do not let the other person off the hook. And so as we've covered this for the last few weeks, Jared talked about how unforgiveness can be a prison that we're caught in. and that retribution can hold us in its grasp. Unforgiveness can hold us in a grasp that robs us of our freedom. And so if you're in this room and you're like, yeah, well, I don't owe them, maybe you're right, but I wonder, do you owe it to yourself? There have been some really incredible studies coming out about the medical benefits of forgiveness and the costs of unforgiveness. And here's a number of them. Number one that comes up, you might not be surprised by, but stress and anxiety can become really significant factors in just our bodies as we carry unforgiveness. Heart attack risk goes up when we're living with resentment. Our cholesterol worsens, our sleep worsens, and we can be at a much higher risk of depression. You might not owe it to them, but I wonder, do you owe it to yourself? And so if you're in this room and you're like, okay, I'm convinced, even if it's not for them, for me, I want to forgive. I'm going to take steps to forgive. I just don't know how. I think all of us will benefit, whether you're in the midst of unforgiveness right now or you are just a human who's going to face it in the future. All of us can benefit from answering the question, how could I forgive what I could never forget? As we talk about the life and story of Jesus, historically, the church has believed something kind of crazy, a little bit weird. If you've never heard this before, it might be a lot to process, but we believe that Jesus was both fully human and fully God. And if you came in here and you're like, okay, maybe it was I thought it was 90-10, maybe he's saying, is it 60-40? No, it's 50-50s. No, the church believes that Jesus was 100% God and 100% man. And if this is true, it has really far-reaching, incredible consequences and opportunities for our lives. If Jesus was fully human, then he had the opportunity to show us how to live fully while human. If Jesus was fully God, then his life can be a model for a life full and overflowing with love and forgiveness. So if you're not sure that you're fully on board with this Jesus is all man and all God thing, that is okay. I'm not going to have time to go into all of that right now. But if the historic church is right, then this has huge implications for us and forgiveness. You see, the documents that we call the New Testament record Jesus completing the ultimate act of forgiveness in human history, where Jesus died in order to rescue the people who committed crimes that he did not. He was executed for the crimes he did not commit in order to save those who were. And as we follow the story of Jesus, I've been asking myself, what is it about him that enabled him, if he was fully human and he struggled with the emotions that I struggle with, what is it about Jesus that enabled this sort of just unbelievable level of forgiveness? And so as we go forward during this morning, I want to look at one story, a story from an author named Mark. Mark wrote a document that's in the New Testament we call the Gospel of Mark. And in the Gospel of Mark, he records eyewitness accounts confirmed by other eyewitnesses about Jesus. And Mark writes this story in his first chapter. A man with leprosy came and he knelt in front of Jesus, begging to be healed. "If you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean," he said. Moved with compassion, Jesus reached out and he touched him. "I am willing," he said, "be healed." Instantly, the leprosy disappeared, and the man was healed. Then Jesus sent him on his way with a stern warning. Don't tell anyone about this. There's 3 words that stood out to me as I read this story. At first, looking at this, it seems like maybe a somewhat standard story of healing if you've read about Jesus before. Jesus meets a guy, he's got this problem, Jesus heals him, everybody leaves happy. But there's 3 words that stand out to me that I think entirely reframe how I understand this story about Jesus. And the first one is really a phrase, and I want you to pay attention to that middle word in this phrase. The first one is Jesus was moved with compassion. He was moved with compassion. Mark doesn't just say that Jesus saw this sick man, and because Jesus was a good man, he came over, or because Jesus was God, he came over, or because it was the right thing to do, Jesus came over and healed him. No, Mark says that whether those things are true or not, Jesus was moved with compassion. This compassion elicited an action out of Jesus that might have been different than what he was planning on or expecting in that moment. At least Mark frames it in this light that compassion moved Jesus to reach out and touch this leper. Now, if you don't know what leprosy is a kind of catch-all name in the ancient Near East for a group of skin diseases that were often very contagious and at that time essentially uncurable in most cases. Most people who have leprosy were ostracized from society. In this society, Jesus should not have even been talking to a leper. The leper should not have approached Jesus. When you were a leper, you were put outside of the realm of what you were allowed, or what your friends and family may have been allowed to continue to engage with in life. Well, Jesus sees him. And he doesn't just see the problem. He doesn't just see the leprosy. He's moved with compassion. He sees the person. Compassion is learning to see the person and not just the problem. Let me illustrate this. If you were here last week, you probably heard Jared talk about this, but it was really helpful for me to think about it this way. If we come over here and we just say humanity. Yep, there we go. And then I come and I just draw a big circle and I say, all right, this is what it is to be human. Everything that it is to be human is inside this circle. We can very easily start placing people like this leper, outside of the circle of humanity, outside of what it means to be human. And here's how we start seeing, the people in Jesus' time started seeing the problem without seeing the person. They saw the leprosy without seeing the sick man there. And Jesus came in and he shows dignity to this person. And as Jared talked about last week, human beings are not problems, but people who are containers of both God and garbage. So you can look back at that sermon if you want to hear more about this. But we can, and in Jesus' time, in the ancient Near East, they very quickly saw the problem without being able to see the person. A person who could be carrying both the image of God in themselves, but also full of garbage. And I wonder for you, is there a problem in your life, in your world, that you just don't see the person on the other side of? For some of us, if we're dealing with resentment or hurt, that problem can be really obvious. But for some of us, I wonder, if we're not in the midst of dealing with hurt, do we have other problems, issues in our world that we have a really hard time seeing past? For some of us, let's just pretend, I guess, for a moment that we're not in an election season. That doesn't affect any of our news feeds, right? Or what about this? What about something that happened at your school or at your kid's school that you are just so focused on this problem? This was unfair. This wasn't okay, that you cannot see the person behind it. Or what about a person in your life, maybe a brother, a sister, a kid, a parent, and they could just keep taking this action. They keep repeating the same behavior over and over again, and you're like, just listen to me. You're gonna hurt yourself more. I'm trying to help you. And you just stop being able to see the person, the hurt person, the messy person who is behind this problem. What is it in your life? What problem can you not see past? I believe that being able to have compassion, meaning we see the person, we humanize the person, we take them, we put them back in the circle of what it means to be human, and we understand that they are containers both of God and garbage. I believe that compassion can unlock the gate that's keeping you from experiencing the freedom that comes with forgiveness. There's a second word that Mark uses in this passage when he talks about Jesus that really struck me, and that word is touch. I wonder why. Mark could have just said, Jesus healed him. Jesus made him clean. Jesus made his skin healthy. Like, why bother coming over here and saying, touched? And for us today, it might evoke some conjecture. We might sit back and say, well, maybe it was this or maybe it was that. And let me just tell you, there's a really clear answer that isn't obvious to us in 2024, but would have been super obvious to someone in 30 AD. And that's this: their entire society in Israel at this time was really functioning around two concepts that were incredibly important for the rhythms of life for people in ancient Israel. And those words were clean and unclean. You were clean if you had completed these rituals and you were this kind of healthy and you hadn't eaten this food, you counted as a clean person. A clean person could participate in society. They could go and participate in economics. They could participate in this religious center that was also just everything in Israel's life. Their social world and their economic world and their legal world and their religious world all tied up into this one. If you were unclean, you needed to stay away from all of those things. You needed to step out until you could become clean again. And so if you're here and you're following, you probably got a really good question. How does one become clean or unclean? And the answer is pretty simple. Most of the time, it has to do with touch. Most of the time, if you went in and you touched a bodily fluid or a thing that was unclean, or you had received, maybe they didn't know about contagious diseases, but they knew that if you touched that person, you might get sick, and now you might be a leper too. Touch was the way that someone became unclean when they were clean most of the time. And so when Jesus is here, this leper's in front of him, and Jesus is moved with compassion. It is not just compassion to make that person feel better, but to also step forward and invite them back into the circle of humanity, to humanize them, to give them dignity, to give them the respect that they deserve. And when Jesus did it, this man is healed. He becomes clean. And all across Jesus' life, he spends time with unclean people. Now, you could be unclean because of sickness or because of bodily fluids or whatever else. You could also become unclean from a variety of actions that were considered unclean. You participated in this, and usually it involved touch with something that we would maybe consider gross or maybe consider unsanitary. But you could become unclean from these actions. And Jesus is known over and over and over again to go out and to participate in life with people who were unclean. In his time, it was people like prostitutes. It was people like tax collectors. It was people that they just got this big banner label, sinners. And so when we think about like somebody who's sick, we don't think, oh, that sick person hurt Jesus, and Jesus had to forgive them by restoring their humanity. But in the ancient Near East, there was a lot of truth to that you're sick because you did something wrong. You're sick because you get thrown in with all these people who act in the wrong way, and all these people who are sick, and all these people that are kind of unmentionable. We put you all over here, and the rest of us get to live in the circle of humanity. I wonder if we don't sometimes maybe do that ourselves. In the 90s, 1999, there was a pastor named Judd Wilhite. And Judd lived in Sin City, Las Vegas. And as he was doing ministry, as he was teaching people and connecting with people and trying to tell them about Jesus, he decided that he wanted to start a church, but this church wouldn't just target the people that we maybe think of as church people, the people who seem like obvious choices to invite into church. He decided he wanted to make a church that would focus on telling people who were normally, especially in the 90s, not really included in church world, not really welcome in spaces with religious people. He wanted to tell them about Jesus. So he opened a church, but not in an old church building, not in a school like many churches do when they open today. He opened a church in Las Vegas in a nightclub Clean up after Saturday, come in on Sunday and tell people who would not otherwise know about Jesus that there is a God who loved them, who cared about them. Now, this resulted in some criticism. You're probably not surprised to hear. This resulted in this group of religious people, religious leaders, coming in and saying, hey, you're starting to act in a way that we think is really enabling to these people. You're starting to live and lead this church in a way that seems like you're affirming all these things that they're doing. And they'd have these people, I mean, you can probably imagine what sort of people in Las Vegas they were inviting in to come and be a part of this church. And we might easily treat people like this as if they're unclean. And yet, Central Church started. Central Church is now the 9th largest church in the country as it grew and grew and grew in Nevada with the goal of connecting people who would not normally attend a church service with the love of God. And in both Jesus' case and Judd's case, the same thing happened where the religious leaders started looking at Judd, started looking at Jesus, and treating them as if they were complicit with the same thing that originally got the person ostracized. Compassion can come off as complicity. Compassion can come off as complicity. Do you have people in your life that you are so shoulder to shoulder with, that you care about and invest in ways that maybe you even get judged for? Not because you're adding to the mess, but because you are so deep in it that some of the mud, some of the mess rubs off on you. You're not throwing more mud into the mix, but you're starting to get messy just by being in relationship. Do you have people in your life like this? Do you hang out with people who don't know Jesus? Do you try to step in as a person who can show love and compassion to people who don't know that there is a God who loves them? Compassion comes off as complicity. The last line in this story that stood out to me is this, and it's really a couple words. Jesus turns to the man and he says this, "Don't tell anyone." We might think Jesus is like, all right, go tell everybody what happened to you. Go tell everybody that I'm God. Go tell everybody that I healed you. Go tell everybody what I did for you today. And instead, Jesus says, don't tell anyone. And here's why. We see, starting in this story and throughout the documents in the New Testament, that as Jesus shows compassion for people who are hurt, people who are broken, people who are messy, and then as Jesus is counted as complicit in their actions, in their mess, that more and more and more the religious leaders, the other just people in his society, start moving towards what would eventually become Jesus' execution. He would die because of the compassion he showed. Compassion comes off as complicity, but I believe it is actually courage. It's actually courage. Jesus showed us a posture of compassion and then showed us the greatest act of forgiveness that a person could ever show by dying for the people that he would forgive. And you and I don't think that we're going to have to die because of our compassion or because of forgiveness. But I think that when I look at myself, I wonder if there's a couple of things that need to die in me in order for me to experience the freedom of forgiveness that I think Jesus wants to offer me. There's 3 things that I think are compassion killers in my life. Number 1, defensiveness. Defensiveness is the quality of being anxious to challenge or avoid criticism. So easy for me to get defensive. And I'm not saying that anybody should live in their life with no boundaries, no expectations of the people around them, that you should live and stay in an unsafe environment. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, I know for me, and I wonder if maybe for you, I need to start replacing defensiveness with healthy, appropriate boundaries in my life. Forgiveness is a process. Boundaries are essential, especially if the person who hurt you doesn't believe that they're in the wrong. Healthy boundaries are essential to bring space for compassion, space to step out of defensiveness. You should not tolerate harm or an unsafe environment. Boundaries are a path towards forgiveness. Henry Cloud wrote a book called Boundaries that I highly recommend. And he says in this that boundaries require courage. Courage because we fear rejection. We fear conflict. We fear hurting someone's feelings. And without boundaries, we can lose ourselves, become overwhelmed, and resentful. Compassion is courage, and boundaries will require courage from me, and I think for you too. Number two, the second thing that can really take over my heart when I want to experience compassion where I can see the person and not just the problem, is outrage. Outrage. Our culture is an outrage culture in so many circumstances. And in an election season, we see this all over, especially in ads and speeches. Outrage is just everywhere. What for you brings out like an outsized reaction? A reaction that's not necessarily helpful or appropriate for the issue in front of you. For some people, it's certain songs or artists, certain words that people use, maybe pop culture. I used to have things like artists and celebrities in pop culture would make me furious when they said different things. It was an outsized reaction in outrage from me. Maybe it's a certain speaker or a certain celebrity. Who in you produces an outsized reaction? Maybe it's another person. Maybe it's a person in your family, a person you spend time with, a person you care about. But I know for me, outrage has to die to make room for compassion. And the third one is retribution. Retribution, where I want to get back at them. We've talked about this over the last few weeks, where I want to go and get even. I want to settle the score. I want the playing field to be leveled. Retribution has to die in order for me to replace it with really a goal of seeking reconciliation. I think you and I, we feel the need for justice. We feel the need for retribution, but I think what we really need is personal healing. What we really need is reconciliation. Now, I have to say, reconciliation isn't always possible. Reconciliation is a two-way street. If you want to replace retribution with reconciliation, the goal is to seek reconciliation, and the other person might choose not to. And that's not up to you. But every one of us can pursue reconciliation instead of retribution. This is going to take time. This is a journey. It doesn't happen overnight. Some of us will need to see a counselor in order to move forward. But I care about you. I want every person in this room to live a full life where you experience the freedom and joy and peace that comes with following Jesus. I do not want you to live in retribution, revenge, unforgiveness, or resentment, even though it feels fair. And honestly, maybe it is. When Jesus died, he could have looked up at God and said anything. He was being executed. And if it was me, I probably would have said, God, why'd you allow this to happen to me? And I don't have an answer for you to that question. But when Jesus looked up at God at the end of his life, he asked, Father, would you forgive them? Friends, I believe that compassion can unlock freedom in your and my life. At the end of 91 days in a 3x4 bathroom, Immaculée was finally free. The French army had shown up in Rwanda and they were going to protect the Tutsi people, and a truck pulled up and the Hutu pastor helped the ladies out and loaded them up into the truck, and the truck drove off, and finally Immaculée was going to be free. Well, on the way to the French camp, she saw a line of Hutu men with machetes. They're standing in the roadway. Well, they're with the French army. They're going to be safe, right? Well, the French officer turned and, to her horror, told the 8 women that they had to get out of the truck. The French were under a clear order not to have any conflict with the locals, any conflict with the Hutu people, and so he had to leave. They hopped out, he drove off, and they could see the camp on the other side, just a few hundred yards away, and they started walking towards it, walking towards this line of men with machetes. And Immaculée looked at him in the eye, and she felt all of the fear to look away, to hide, but she prayed this prayer. These are her words. Holy Spirit, you can preserve me. And as she looked him in the eye, she saw something change. Maybe it was him, maybe it was her. But for a moment, she was able to see his humanity. That he was made in the image of God, but like all of us, we're containers of both God and garbage. She felt compassion for him. And he locked her eye as if silently promising to hurt her. And then all of a sudden he looked down, looked away, and the women walked into the camp. Immaculée travels the world now, telling stories about forgiveness and hope in the midst of darkness and fear. Friends, I want this to be a place that's full of forgiveness. I want this to be a place where you and I can experience hope and experience healing, where even though justice and retribution are fair, we're not held by them. We're not imprisoned by them, and we're not stuck in them. And I really believe that compassion can unlock the path to that forgiveness. There's nothing in this world that's so broken God can't fix. There are some things in this world that only God can fix. Only God can help you with humanizing somebody who we say, oh, she just. They're a monster. So we're going to sing a song, and during this song, we're going to take a moment to celebrate that Jesus has removed the prison walls from around us. He has given you a path towards freedom from being locked in resentment or hurt or shame, and given you a path forward. And then we've got one of the biggest celebrations that we get to have here as a church afterwards. We have 6 people from our family ministry who've decided to give their lives to Jesus and be baptized, and they'll be out here. So as we sing this song, feel free to stand and sing with us. Feel free to stay in your seat and take a second to process this. But then when we've got baptisms up here, I hope everyone is cheering along with me for the work that God has done in this people and in this church.